am in the middle of the final boss for the Callisto Protocol, playing on the hardest difficulty with maximum security, and I am very low on ammunition. I have no health, practically, and yeah, it's actually kind of challenging. We'll run around here. What I'm doing is I'm trying to find some ammunition that I can utilize, because as you can see, I'm very low. Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna... Oh, shit. Well, that was easier than I thought. The Callisto Protocol, developed by Striking Distance Studios under publisher Krafton, sees veteran game developer Glen Schofield return to a genre that he helped revolutionize with 2008's Dead Space. The Callisto Protocol, when in comparison to Dead Space, shares many similarities, but ultimately is a much different beast from a parallel standpoint. Now, this game was released on all major platforms for both console and PC, including last-generation hardware, and both sides of the aisle have reported major performance issues in the form of stuttering, especially with regard to the PC audience, which is the platform that I played this game on. I will not comment much on the stuttering problems other than the fact that I updated my drivers before this game was released, and while I experienced stuttering with both the in-game cutscenes as well as gameplay from time to time, it wasn't egregious enough to permanently disrupt my experience with the game. After having played through this game for around 14 hours, I did complete it on the hardest difficulty setting dubbed Maximum Security. First and foremost, the Callisto Protocol, just getting the obvious question out of the way, this is a good game. However, it's not a great game. There are a few standout issues that hold the game back from achieving its full potential. Similar to Dead Space and Resident Evil, Alien Isolation, and then some, this is a story-driven survival horror game that places its focus on narrative plot-driving elements and item management, although on a much smaller scale. There's one major thing that separates the Callisto Protocol from the rest of the pack, which is the game's focus on melee combat. Survival horror games are typically terrible at melee combat, which is used almost exclusively to separate the player from the enemy on screen and nothing else, the exceptions being Resident Evil 4 through 6. Survival horror games do this to increase the tension on screen in order to amplify the horror element that these games are known for. The Callisto Protocol, however, takes a much different approach to the formula by flipping it entirely. 90% of the combat that's presented in the Callisto Protocol is based around melee encounters. That's a one-on-one affair with the AI on screen. The system is very straightforward. You dodge by holding down left or right on the left stick and attack with the trigger buttons. In a nutshell, it's very similar to what was in The Last of Us 2, except it feels better to control, but you can tell they took inspiration from what was present in that game. You also have guns with a pop-up inventory very similar to Dead Space. The difference is that the guns in this game are meant to be used in conjunction with the physical attacks rather than for use on their own. They're basically combo extensions of the melee element that's presented here. I like this system, for one, because it feels good to control by being very snappy and responsive, but also for its overall change of pace from other survival horror games. Nevertheless, the combat as it stands in this game is a double-edged sword. While I can appreciate developers trying something new, it ultimately comes at a high cost here. Before, I mentioned that I played this game on the hardest difficulty setting, and during my play sessions with this, I noticed how easy the game was. The melee combat is so smooth to control that it essentially breaks the entire game from a combat standpoint. There are only a few points during this game where I felt I was challenged by what was thrown at me. Throughout the game, you run into situations where you're tasked with fighting multiple enemies on screen. This creates a new problem with the system. Similar to the new God of War games, the camera is so tight up on your ass that it becomes impossible to keep track of everything that's on screen, and unlike the new God of War games, this game doesn't have warning markers to signal the player what's coming at them on screen. This essentially makes the combat system frustrating at various points throughout the experience. Another issue is that the enemy variety is rather sparse here with the mutants. You only have a handful of enemies that make appearances consistently throughout. This didn't really bother me, but if you compare it to a Resident Evil game or even the Dead Space games, it's rather underwhelming. The one enemy that Striking Distance implemented that I thought was very clever design are these spider-like mutants that will flee and attempt to attack the player off-screen. If you follow them, they'll crawl on the wall or the ceiling and attempt to hide by blending in with the environment using camouflage. I thought that was fantastic enemy design personally. You also have these blind mutants that you have to sneak past or take out from behind using stealth, which is another element that separates this game from Dead Space and Resident Evil. As I mentioned in a recent video regarding stealth being incorporated in the upcoming Resident Evil 4 remake, stealth should be implemented and utilized in more survival horror games to emphasize the scare factor. I did appreciate that element as it was displayed in this game. Regarding boss fights, you have just one at the very end of the game, and you have a mini-boss. This annoying two-headed thing that's basically a damage sponge that you're forced to fight 4 times late in the experience. I thought the last boss fight, the way it was designed, was good. It felt like a Resident Evil game where you're low on ammunition and you must scour the environment to hunt for scraps of ammunition. It was a real challenge on the hardest difficulty setting. The mini-boss, I hated. And the fact that the game forces you to suffer through it 4 times made it more unbearable. That's a sign of laziness on the behalf of Striking Distance. The story in the Callisto Protocol starts off promising, but it quickly devolves into some usual bullshit about a conspiracy with an outbreak that infected an entire population from some extraterrestrial life form, and the rest is basically what you'd expect. This game breaks no ground whatsoever in the arena of storytelling, and the fact that it's so cliche to the point of disgust made me write it off as some old bullshit long before the credits started rolling. The redeeming factor of the story are the performances of the actors and the motion capture, which is top-notch AAA quality content on display here, but so was God of War Ragnarok and a bunch of other games, so it's not that impressive, but worth noting regardless. The art direction, graphics, and music were all fantastic in this game. I appreciated the many nods to the Dead Space series with the health holograms on the character models, the eerie musical motifs reminiscent of Dead Space, the highly detailed weather effects, blood, and sweat, and especially the brief freefall moment that felt ripped right out of Dead Space 2's zero-gravity freefall segments. This may not be Dead Space, but the spirit of Dead Space still lives on in this game, which I enjoyed. Lastly, with regard to supplemental content, as it stands now, it's very disappointing. Despite Glen Schofield claiming that Striking Distance didn't withhold any content from this game, the description of the Season Pass says otherwise. What got me was when it lists new death animations being added to the game. You can tell they removed content because the death animations here are very limited. I died many times throughout this game and saw the same 3 or 4 death animations over and over and over again. Also, there's no New Game Plus, which is ridiculous. Horizon Forbidden West had this issue before it was eventually patched into that game. Any RPG or survival horror game should have New Game Plus, so the player can, if they choose to, keep all of their upgrades and experience the game again on a different playing field, but alas, there is no such option here. Ultimately, the Callisto Protocol is good, but it's not Dead Space, or even on the same level as Dead Space or Resident Evil, despite its many similarities and nods to those games. It's also not a game that has any longevity after you complete it. The story is cliched to the point of boredom, and the performance problems that people have listed make it worse. It's a good experience, but unless you're a completionist who likes to hunt for achievements, there's no reason to play through this a second time. I have no doubts that the Dead Space and Resident Evil 4 remakes will offer more quality content than the Callisto Protocol when they release next year. Well, at least it's far better than that Scorn bullshit, so there's that. But yeah, it's not a must-play if you're not a die-hard fan of this genre. When it comes to Glen Schofield, because a lot of people were excited for this game, myself included, simply because he was involved with the project as game director, and they were excited to see his return to this genre, and I fully understand that. However, some things can't be repeated twice. Using some examples, right? When George Lucas announced that he was making the Star Wars prequels, everyone lost their shit in excitement over the possibility of there being more Star Wars movies. Because at the time, we didn't have nothing but the original trilogy. And then the prequels came out and they weren't good and, people turned on George Lucas. Using another example, when it was announced that Warner Brothers was making a prequel series to the Harry Potter films, once again, people lost their shit in excitement, especially with the news that J.K. Rowling herself was actually going to be helming the screenplay for these movies. And then J.K. Rowling ruined her own reputation by making some questionable comments about the LGBTQ community, and she also wrote some very bad screenplays, and the movies themselves were bombed critically and became worse over time. And yet another example, when it was announced that there was going to be a new Matrix movie, people lost their shit once again in excitement, especially with the news that Lana Wachowski was going to return and direct a new movie. And people were excited about that because formerly Lana Wachowski was one of the two directors of the original Matrix trilogy. But then the Matrix Resurrections came out and it was dog shit. And not only was it dog shit, but it actually bombed both critically and financially at the box office. Basically, the point is, what Glen Schofield did with Dead Space was basically lightning in the bottle. It's very hard to capture lightning in the bottle. It's especially difficult to capture lightning in the bottle twice. I mean, just look at Marvel Phase 4. Most of the movies in Phase 4 are terrible. The upcoming Avatar movie from James Cameron. Apparently, Warner Brothers is thinking that movie is actually going to make its astronomical budget back. Sometimes creators, as brilliant as they are, just cannot repeat what made them popular in the first place. And basically, that's exactly what happened here with the Callisto Protocol. It's not as good as Dead Space. It's not remotely as good as Dead Space. And it's unlikely that Glen Schofield will make another game that matches Dead Space's quality. So, it is what it is.